Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you at our lunchtime meeting today. Before we begin, I just want to invite everyone to turn your cameras on if you're able. It'd be great to see your faces, and we'd love to say hi and to see you for this hour. So if you're in a place where you can, please turn those cameras on. Yeah, we'd love to see you, and yeah, it's great to see those of you who do have your cameras on. Yes, before we begin, my name is Leah, and I'm the event coordinator at Bay Nature magazine. For those of you who don't know, Bay Nature is a quarterly print publication based in Berkeley, and we focus on nature and conservation content, all rooted in the Bay Area, the 9 counties of the Bay Area. And we're a nonprofit publication, and in addition to our magazine, we also have weekly news updates about nature and pieces that are published on our website only. And we've also begun to develop our events program with virtual events like this one, as well as in-person hikes and outings, also in the 9 counties of the Bay Area. So thank you all so much for being here and supporting our events program and our Nature magazine. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Mari Galloway. Mari is, the California Program Director for the Wildlands Network, and Mari leads initiatives to enhance wildlife connectivity and protect core habitats statewide. With policy expertise and a deep passion for California's ecology, she strategically connects partners, resources, and information for data-driven ecosystem efforts. Mari's work coordinating wildlife crossings, advancing research, and collaborating with diverse stakeholders informs policy solutions and addresses systematic barriers. She holds a BS in environmental science from Cal Poly Humboldt and a law degree from the University of Oregon. Thank you so much, Mari, for being here today. We're really lucky to have you and just really excited for your presentation. So I'll turn it over to you for this presentation that was inspired by a piece by Jesse that was published earlier last year, all about wildlife crossings. So thank you so much, Mari, and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Leah. And thanks, Bay Nature, for inviting me to speak. And it's good to be here, recognizing one or two names and faces. So it's good to see you all again. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Are folks seeing this? I'm not seeing you.
Yes, it looks good to me.
Okay, great. Yeah, and so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the essential role of wildlife crossings in restoring ecosystems here in California. And so just to get us started, I'm going to provide a little bit of background about the person who's going to be speaking at you for the next 40 or so minutes. But I'm born and raised lifelong Californian. I grew up in the Central Valley. I was fortunate enough to spend my summers up in Ebbets Pass in the Sierra Nevadas. I don't know, it doesn't look like these pictures are showing up, but my mom's a veterinarian, and so I actually grew up all my life trying to find animals that have been hit on the side of the roadway and bringing them to wildlife centers, and always, grew up with a deep kind of respect for our wildlife here in the state of California, and went to Humboldt to study ecology. And was the bummer about studying ecology is that you're learning about how kind of we're really not in a bad place with our ecosystems, especially here in California. And so I got really starting in college, getting involved in some advocacy, and actually going up into old growth Douglas fir to try to find sign for of retrieval, which we then shared with the lawyers who were working to counteract some timber proposals. And so that's when I got really excited about the idea of trying to better connect science into decision making. And so that's when I felt inspired to go to law school. And so I was really fortunate in my time at University of Oregon to actually work on advancing a lot of policy initiatives, including in DC and the federal level, and just seeing the power of bringing science and policy proposals together to advancing biodiversity, health, and conservation. And so I was really fortunate after law school to start working at Wildlands Network to develop our California program here in my home state. And Wildlands Network actually works across North America with a mission to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America so that life and all of its diversity can thrive. And really what that means is we really try to connect habitats and functional landscapes on a continental scale using science-based research and innovative policy to prevent that biodiversity loss and promote climate resilient landscapes. And we do this by working very closely with our local partners and government agency staff on the ground, working on trying to empower local communities to invest in these conservation measures where, the whole of which are greater than its parts. And so, what I'm going to be walking through a little bit today is learning a little bit more about what wildlife crossings are and why they're so important, and why they're so important here in California, and explaining how currently government and tribes and NGOs and wildlife experts are all working together to advance these crossings here in the state of California. So getting back to really the fundamentals, why focus on wildlife at all with all of the different threats and pressures on our world and our environment? And I've always go over this because I was stumped by a question one time with a reporter when she asked why are wildlife important, and I always felt that they were inherently important. But for those of you who need a little bit more rationale than that, wildlife are real indicators of our ecological health, that our ecosystems are functioning and that they are able to deliver on the ecological benefits that humans depend on to survive. So if the inherent value of wildlife wasn't enough for you, they are real indicators of the ability of us to continue to survive on the landscape in the long term. Declining populations of wildlife, by contrast, are a sign of threatening the function of our ecosystem, and that we, potentially won't be able to have those ecosystem benefits. And that also in turn decreases our resilience from stressors like climate change. Unfortunately, those alarm bells are going off. We're seeing that the average size of wildlife populations has fallen by 73% since 1970s, huge declines. And we're seeing that a primary reason for these declines is habitat loss. This is true across the globe, but it's especially true here in California. It's the primary threat to the majority of vertebrate species, but a variety of other species, including our invertebrates, plants, and fungi. And a lot of things something we haven't really been thinking about until the last few decades is not just the impact of habitat loss, but with habitat loss, we have habitat fragmentation. And that's the process by which large and contiguous habitats get divided into smaller and isolated patches of habitat. And fragmentation is a real problem, because wildlife need to move. And wildlife need to move for a variety of reasons. They need to move for a lot of the same reasons we need to move and leave our houses, for example. They need to find food and water. They need to find shelter. They need to find genetically unrelated mates. This is especially true for our carnivores like wolves and pumas that sometimes will travel 1 to 200 miles to find a genetically diverse mate and establish their habitat and home range. They also need to move to adapt to climate change. This includes, slower range shift as our atmosphere and changes on the landscape are occurring, but that's also including adaptations to extreme weather events that are exacerbated by climate change, including droughts and wildfires and floods. And so, how do we make sure that we can give wildlife the ability to move throughout the landscape and access those resources they need to continue to survive? And one major strategy to try to achieve that is through wildlife corridors. Michael Soule is one of the founders of Wildlands Network back in 1990. Wildlife corridors are the most important conservation strategy that you've never heard of. And fortunately, that statement is much less true today at the time he said that, because now wildlife corridors and connectivity are recognized as a foundational strategy to combating the biodiversity and climate crisis on local, state, and federal levels. And so this is just an example of what a corridor could look like. And so this is a local example in the Bay Area where SC Wildlands actually undertook a mapping effort to map out where are these, open spaces with some level of protection that serve as really important cores for wildlife, and what are those potential connections between them that we need to be working to manage to make sure that they can remain permeable and functional for wildlife to be able to access these habitats. But even if you do, put together this great mapping and protect these landscapes, inevitably, these networks are going to run up against roads, which are a formidable barrier to this movement that is so important to wildlife. In addition to roads being a barrier to wildlife, they can also have a really large impact on their population through direct mortality when vehicles collide with wildlife. And so this is an example of some of what wildlife crossings look like. They come in many forms, and they're really designed to help alleviate that problem of when wildlife coming up to the road have an opportunity to safely cross. And most folks, when you think of wildlife overpasses, probably think of the image that you see to the left, like the wildlife overpass on Highway 93 in Nevada. But they come in many other different shapes and sizes, including this one in Kenya that's been designed for elephants. These are actually understandably quite a bit larger than some we have here in California, but we do have underpasses that look really similar to this, and they're typically around 12 by 12 dimension. We actually have two of such structures on Highway 50 in Placer County. A monkey rope crossing in Costa Rica. And this is a very simple and cost-effective design because you are finding in Costa Rica that where there was a break in the canopy where roads move through the forest, monkeys would have to climb down onto the forest floor, which not only creates a risk as they try to cross roads, but it also is increasing their risk of predation. So by this simple adaptation, by just tying in ropes across the road, was able to allow them to have a connected canopy and be able to safely move through the forest. And then we also are seeing increasingly wildlife crossings for our herps, our reptiles and amphibians, like this tortoise tunnel in Utah, and even wildlife crossings for crabs and crab migration on Christmas Island in Australia. So all to show that there's a ton of different wildlife crossings for many different species. And the good news is these crossings are effective. The left shows some stats here that was put together by the Federal Highway Administration. I should note that these numbers were from 2010. So we can probably presume that these numbers are quite a bit higher, specifically the average total cost per collision. And really this, cost of, with your collisions is taking into account the cost of the animal, the cost to personal property, personal injury, emergency services, public utilities. All of those add up to have a pretty significant cost on the public. But wildlife crossings are shown to be very effective at reducing these collisions, reducing them sometimes by up to 97%, more commonly around 85 to 90%, but still showing to be extremely effective. And we find that actually when you tally the costs associated with collisions avoided, that they are typically, that we find that these crossings are actually cost effective and that they can pay for themselves within their lifespan. And nowhere wildlife crossing is probably more important than in our state of California. And that's because we are so biodiverse here in this state. Over 30% of all plants and vertebrate species in the US occur here in California. We have 650 endemic vertebrate species. That means they're species that occur here and nowhere else in the world. And in addition to being the most biodiverse state in the nation, we are also the most populous state in the nation. And unfortunately, we're not balancing those two things very well. This is a map that was produced by the New York Times that's showing concentrations of imperiled biodiversity, which is shown in that dark red. And you're seeing California really pop up on that map as having the most imperiled biodiversity of the state, of any state in the contiguous United States. So how can we better work to coexist with this incredible biodiversity that we share on this landscape? And again, crossings are a critical way of being able to ensure those adaptations. But it's complicated in California because, again, of all of these different species. Desert tortoise are declining significantly in numbers across the desert because they need fencing to keep them off these roadways. They're experiencing huge direct mortalities. And when you think about the large landscapes desert tortoise occupy and their large, long lifespans and slow reproductive rates, direct mortality occasionally on these roads can have huge impacts on their population. We're seeing mountain lions in Southern California being increasingly isolated through being trapped on these islands of habitat through dense networks of highways and developments, and finding that they're unable to move to find genetically diverse mates. And what happens is when they are unable to move, they end up inbreeding to the extent they no longer have the genetic diversity that's required for them to reproduce, which is what results in what's called an extinction vortex, which means once they stop reproducing, these populations just disappear. So again, formidable challenges. We also have a lot of smaller critters, our amphibians and newts and salamanders that might not have to move over hundreds of miles like some of our other species like mountain lions, but they do have to move. And where their home ranges intersect with roads, we see that their populations sometimes even disappear just from the impact of direct mortality of roads as they're migrating in their breeding seasons. Also migratory corridors. We don't have a whole lot of migration corridors in the state of California when compared to other Western states, but we do have some, and I'll talk about how we're working to address some of those migrations later on in the presentation. But in addition to some of these species-specific, actual substantive challenges, we also have broader scale challenges. Lack of data and funding is always prevalent. Government agency and staff capacity is never at the levels we need it to be. There's also a lot of silos between agencies and programs, which is uh, typically not such a formidable challenge for a lot of conservation issues, but with wildlife connectivity, which demands cooperation with many different land managers, those silos become really, for lack of a better term, barriers to advancing connectivity on such a large scale. And while we're trying to deal with all these barriers, our systems are dynamic and they're changing drastically with climate change and many other changes. And so how can we manage for what's seemingly always a moving target? And so how can we get everyone aligned, make sure we're all rowing in the same direction, identifying the same priorities, and again, trying to get at making our conservation investments on the value or on the landscape greater than its parts. And so our role in trying to ensure that that happens is building relationships and facilitating these large working groups on the ground. We pull all these different land managers together with wildlife experts. It allows us to pull resources and expertise and capacity. We work on closing data gaps for when we're working in these collaborations and we're identifying that there is a need for more information. We work with our agency partners to help design research and fundraise to collect that data that's needed. Making sure that there's adequate funds to continue these efforts. We apply for a lot of different grants and try to also ensure that our local partners on the ground have sufficient funding to ensure that this work can remain sustainable and into the future. And this is where my law degree comes in, is advancing legislation and policy to address some of these systemic barriers on the ground, and work very closely with our partners at the Center for Biological Diversity and co-sponsoring and drafting the Room to Roam Act, AB 1889, which passed last year and requiring cities and counties to incorporate wildlife connectivity in their local land use plans, as well as passing the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act in 2022, which creates the first ever connectivity remediation program within Caltrans and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and requiring them to incorporate wildlife passage features in their ongoing projects. And so all this work together is really focused on how do we, get more of these crossings across the state. And so one example of where we've put this into practice is actually in developing California Wildlife Crossing Database. And this might look familiar to some folks from that article that Leah mentioned, that Jesse Greenspan worked on, utilize some of our data to kind of tell the story of what crossing efforts were moving forward across the state. And we put this together because we realized somewhere along the way that we actually didn't know where all the wildlife crossings were. And we're actually surprised in undertaking this effort that there were many more than we thought. And also you might see these kind of strange red lines here on the map, and those are barriers identified by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife that are priority barriers to address for wildlife connectivity. And then that legislation I mentioned, AB 2344, also funded not just staff capacity for CDFW, but also Caltrans, where they're working to identify where are some of these priority culverts and bridges they want to replace, and where is that intersecting with some of their upcoming projects. And so their list of priority projects is available online through their website, and happy to share a link to that if folks haven't had a chance to take a look at this yet. So on top of that, California is already advancing some crossings. We have been a little bit slow to advancing crossings when compared to other states in the US, but we're catching up. And one of those is the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Overpass on Highway 101, which once built will be the largest wildlife overpass spanning 10 lanes of freeway in the world. And so that's really aimed at trying to alleviate some of those pressures that those mountain lions in Southern California are facing, and allowing these mountain lions to be able to access other parts of habitat across these 10-line freeways to be able to, again, find genetically diverse mates. A wildlife underpass on Highway 17 has already been constructed, and you can see from the picture there that it's still pretty raw, it's brand new, but regardless, wildlife footage is showing that mountain lions are already using this structure. So really exciting to see these structures getting built, and not only getting built, but they're being used. So one example of where Wildlands Network is advancing some of this work and what that kind of looks like on the ground is on Highway 395. And the goal is to reconnect landscapes between the Sierra Nevada and the Great Basin. We're working with a huge array of partners. The partners listed here have actually grown since I first made this slide, and now we have over 90 contacts in our working group that meets quarterly to advance these efforts. And so the reason we started focusing on Highway 395 was actually because when we first started working in California, met with Caltrans and California Department of Fish and Wildlife and asked where we could best add value to their ongoing efforts. And we were really fortunate to connect with some folks here in Northern California at Caltrans and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who are incredible champions of this work and have actually been advancing a lot of these crossings quietly on their own for years. And so when we reached out to them, they actually knew exactly where they wanted to plug us in, which is pretty rare. And they really pointed to this section of Highway 395, a little north of Reno, up into Susanville, if folks are familiar with that landscape in Lassen County. And this area was a priority because we have deer migrations moving through, and you can see that pictured there on the map. This is based on some telemetry data that California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been collecting through GIS collar data. And finding that these deer move up to the Sierra Nevada to access that high elevation meadow forage in the summertime. And then once it gets cold and the snow comes down, they move down to the low-lying sagebrush habitats in the winter. And that's in Eastern California and Nevada. And they have to cross Highway 395 to do this migration. And we're seeing a high rate of wildlife vehicle collisions associated with this section of highway. And so but the problem is that Caltrans and California Department of Fish and Wildlife knew this 70-mile stretch of highway was a problem, but they didn't know where there existing culverts and bridges that were facilitating wildlife movement. Where are there sections of the highway where wildlife are getting hit more than others? Are there sections of highway where there are no structures or no functional structures where we might want to consider either upgrading culverts and bridges or building new wildlife passage infrastructure? So we worked to develop a research design with our partners at Caltrans and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where we deployed cameras on every existing structure on the highway above 3 feet in diameter, conducted weekly roadkill surveys and tracking surveys. So actually looking at track and sign along the highway to try to understand how wildlife were interacting with the highway, which then in turn informed camera placement. And we're really fortunate to hire Pathways for Wildlife and partner with Pathways to actually do the data collection. And you'll see shortly, they've been able to collect some incredible data, which has given us some really keen insight on where enhancements need to be made. So taking you a little bit into the field, this is my favorite part of working on wildlife crossings, is actually looking at some of this data that you're collecting. And so you're not only understanding who is using the highway, but to what extent and where. So we've been fortunate to see a lot of bobcats and their kittens. They're in their cubs. And one thing I wanted to note here that you probably saw those cubs looking a little bit pensive and getting in that structure. And so one thing that's really cool about road ecology and these structures is that the moms often teach their young where to use these structures, where it is to safely cross. And so these cubs will likely grow up to learn that these bridges are safe ways to cross the highway. And so for that reason, we actually see oftentimes once these wildlife crossings are built, that they actually increase in efficacy over time as generations are teaching their young where they can safely cross. We're also excited to capture the first ever wolf on camera in California crossing under one of these structures on Highway 395. And seeing mountain lions with kittens as young as 6 months moving through some of these structures, which is cool. And again, one of the best parts of these projects is even getting to watch these families grow up. So here are the same. But again, we came here unfortunately, because we are in their migrations, and so we're grateful to capture some of these migrations very much so impact using some of the structures on the inside. So this, as we see that there are some structures on Highway 395 that are currently functional. So that is telling us where we want to make sure that those continue to be functional into the future. And we also, but there are some areas where there are no existing structures, where we're seeing a lot of roadkill. And so we are able to partner with Lassen County Transportation Commission and Mark Thomas Engineering and DUDEC to apply for a Wildlife Conservation Board grant to actually do the planning and design necessary to construct 2 wildlife overpasses on Highway 395. One thing I also want to note is we're extremely grateful to Caltrans, which we've been in close collaboration with and sharing all of our data throughout this entire process. And they actually utilized our data in an upcoming repaving project they have in our project area, where they are intending to upgrade 5 structures to accommodate wildlife. So this Wildlife Conservation Board grant will be in addition to that work they're doing. So really trying to look at how do we make this whole section of highway more permeable and safer for drivers and wildlife. I also want to note, with the same funding source, there is a project happening here in the Bay. The Alameda County Resource Conservation District has been the grant applicant on this process, in collaboration with the Rhodocology Center at UC Davis, Mark Thomas Engineering, and I put their contact information. They also have a website if folks are interested in checking out their ongoing efforts and learning more. So to move a little bit further south, and another effort is really kind of looking across the Tahoe Basin at where not only roads and wildlife crossings are needed to help wildlife safely cross roads, but also zooming out and looking at the landscape to get a more holistic picture of how wildlife are moving through the landscape, so we can inform not only where crossings are needed on highways, but also inform conservation and management priorities in the Tahoe Basin. And so we are advancing this study in 3 different sections. Unfortunately, we're only able to do the California side of the Tahoe Basin, since we are funded through the California Tahoe Conservancy, which is a California state agency, but do intend to pursue funding opportunities to hopefully expand our study efforts into the East Basin. But essentially what we're doing with each of these sections of the Tahoe Basin is studying them for a period of 2 years. So we are starting our 2nd year of monitoring now in the South Tahoe Basin. And what we're essentially trying to do here is, so very similar to our Highway 395 project, we've identified where existing structures are. We are monitoring existing culverts and bridges. We're conducting roadkill surveys. But we're also doing we also put cameras out on the landscape in a randomized grid. And we've been working in close partnership again with our partners at Pathways for Wildlife. Tanya Diamond is pictured there on the left, who's been actually collecting all this data to help inform our study. And here's pictures like this, where you see there's some nice big structures, but there's always in between these waters. And so wildlife aren't actually utilizing them to take this back to water. We're seeing areas like no structures. So all of this is providing us important information and clues on where we might need to be enhancing sections of the roadway to allow wildlife safely cross, but it's also giving us insight on how wildlife might be moving through the landscape, where some of these linkages might exist in what's otherwise a pretty developed area. And we have been trying to get a better understanding of this by, again, not only setting up cameras on the highway, but also sending them out on a randomized grid on the landscape. And so we've been capturing a lot of really interesting footage to help us better understand how wildlife are approaching the highway. I jumped the gun a little bit. There's a couple more wildlife crossing these culverts here. because we're seeing that wildlife are using culverts as small as this. A bobcat might not be as surprising. A black bear might not be so big. All I think we need is so seeing all of the different wildlife kind of structure this small, giving us a clue that this is some sort of wildlife, likely some sort of wildlife thoroughfare within the South Tahoe Basin. So again, this is kind of where we're setting up for cameras on the landscape to better understand wildlife. And we've been finding an amazing amount of porcupines within the Tahoe Basin, which has been fascinating because they've really been on decline throughout the Sierra Nevada to the extent that California Department of Fish and Wildlife has actually created a monitoring program to better understand where they're occurring. And so we were pretty surprised to see such a high density of porcupines in the Tahoe Basin. But as you could probably see by the way they're just kind of rolling around here on these logs, they're not very good travelers. And so where roads impact their habitat, it's not a not a good pairing. Porcupines do not do well when they're close to roads. So getting a little wonky in here to more of our GIS modelers out there, but the reason we're doing these linkage cameras is to also validate some of the modeling we're doing. So this is a model we developed in the South Tahoe Basin for porcupine, a cost surface model. And essentially the green areas are areas that we've identified as porcupine, based on the habitat conditions and characteristics, will very likely be there or possibly be there. The blue areas are poor movement, they're less likely to be traveling through. And so some of those areas that like you see on that long strip there is actually the airport in the South Lake Tahoe Basin. So, could a porcupine be there? Maybe, but probably not. The red are highly unsuitable habitat. So the big blob you see there is actually fallen leaf lake. So porcupines are probably not going to be swimming to move throughout the landscape. And so the green gives us some indication when you're seeing more of these dense areas on where we might anticipate porcupines would be, and can try to assume based on where you could connect those together, where they might be moving through. And so we're seeing actually that our camera data and roadkill sightings are actually aligning pretty well with where our models are predicting these species will be. Another thing we're doing in the course of this study is actually setting up cameras to try to record pine marten. Pine marten are a species of concern. They're also in decline. And there was actually a study done by Harvey about 15 years ago on one of the California Tahoe Conservancy properties that found numerous detections of pine marten. And so we actually went to recreate that study and set cameras out in the exact locations of the effort that was done 15 years ago, and unfortunately have not recorded one pine marten in any of those locations, which is potentially concerning because it indicates that pine marten, for whatever reason, might not be in that region anymore. So we were really relieved to at least find this pine marten captured on camera on Highway 89 near Luther Pass. Again, these linkage cameras are also allowing us to see some more wildlife behavior in the forest, including this mom and her cub playing for about a half hour. Weasels are another species that we've been recording throughout our study of so all of this is kind of amounting to, again, this is working on trying to identify where our road enhancements, do road enhancements need to be made, and where can we be bringing in county partners and partners with California Tahoe Conservancy and Land Trust and other land managers in the basin to understand where wildlife are moving and where we might be able to better manage and coexist with residents and visitors of the basin. So this is kind of a just overview of a couple of the projects we're working on in California and how we're trying to advance some of these crossings and connectivity efforts statewide. And really, connectivity is necessary for climate and biodiversity resilience. This is broadly recognized across the conservation science communities. And crossings are really a critical strategy for achieving that connectivity, for allowing safe wildlife to be able to safely navigate our roads and access resources on habitats that they need to survive. And collaboration to achieve these is critical. We need to be working, on all of these projects at the very least with Caltrans and counties and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and local nonprofits and tribes. And oftentimes these collaborations go far beyond that, but it really is what's needed to make sure that we're all benefiting from the same information and that we can pool and resource our resources and capacity together to advance a lot of these projects statewide. Um, so that concludes my presentation. Thanks you all for listening in, and happy to dig into any of those projects a little more or answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mari. That was amazing, and all of the footage was just so fun to watch and so cool. But we can move to Q&A now, and how we'll do this is I'll go through the chat, and so anyone who has questions, please type those into the chat, and I'll just start from the top and call on whoever entered each question and ask you to unmute and ask your question out loud, or if you prefer, I can also read your question out, and then Mari can respond. But I'll just start from the very top, and those of you with questions, please just continue typing them into the chat. But the first question, it looks like, is from Laura. Laura Baker, do you mind unmuting Laura and asking your question?
Hi, I was asking how to prevent, and a lot of your talk has addressed this. I asked this question at the very beginning of the talk. So, to prevent, doing wildlife crossings is expensive and difficult, and to be able to plan in advance for what we know are good wildlife corridors is really my question. Where I live in Northwest Sonoma County, in a rural, it's the Wallala River watershed. We have wildlife corridors of all kinds. One goes through our property, and we have cameras up. How do we go about getting this information to people who could do something about that? I guess would be the best way to phrase this.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is after 2344 was passed in 2022, 2020 in 2023, we got a budget change proposal through that actually hired 8 new full-time connectivity positions at California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they're assigned by region. And so they are tasked with kind of being the ones that are pulling that data together and identifying these priorities. So I think Sonoma County is region 4, if I recall, with CDFW, in which case your contact would be Michael Sawaya. But I can try to find a link to where that information is. So that is the person you want to be coordinating with CDFW to make sure they're inputting in all that information. But another thing to note is what Caltrans is doing in their development of their program is that they are actually intending to partner with the California Conservation Corps to do an assessment of taking pictures of every single structure on the state highway system to try to see, could this functionally work for wildlife? If not, how could it be designed if we know this is an area that's important for wildlife? And so that when Caltrans has a planned project where they might have to, for example, upgrade that structure, they can incorporate design specifications that will facilitate that wildlife movement.
Hmm, okay. I would love that contact in CDFW.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Laura. And looks like our next question is from Allison. Allison, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Yep, there I am. Okay, hello, thank you. Yeah, I'm just wondering if we citizens who are living in these areas notice an area of risk, which I have. What's the correct way to contact the authorities to say we'd really like to see a wildlife crossing considered in this or that place? I have seen deer resting in the pavement between east and westbound 24 near the Caldecott. And that's how do they get there? How do they get back to the side for safety? It's pretty risky for them. And it's that area also heading east all the way toward Walnut Creek.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I know a lot of those areas are really important for wildlife. And typically what I've been learning now with working on these transportation projects with Caltrans is they typically identify numerous areas of need on the state highway system, culverts and bridges that need to be updated, repaving that needs to happen. And when they can kind of find enough of those within a close enough geographic area, that's when they push a project and try to upgrade all those things at once. It's more efficient. So a lot of times we might, from an ecological perspective, be identifying areas that we know is a priority for wildlife. We need to address this area for wildlife. But unfortunately, Caltrans oftentimes is very inefficient, both costly and efficient. I'm not saying that correctly. And inefficient for a number of other reasons. So one way they have found to try to advance these crossing structures strategically is when you see a project moving forward in one of those areas you noted that is you find important for connectivity, that's when you want to be reaching out to Caltrans and say, hey, I see you're doing this project. We have a lot of data that's showing this is problematic. Are you intending to incorporate any wildlife passage features in the scope of this project? So that's one example. The other is probably the same answer I have for Laura. If you're finding this data and you're collecting it and noticing that this area is a concern, sharing that with your partners at CDFW who can elevate that to a priority. Another kind of answer I'll throw out to that question is there is a way to advance some of those standalone projects. And fortunately, we received significant funds from the Prop 4 climate bond towards wildlife crossings. And so where those priority projects exist, where there might not be some other Caltrans project scheduled, that's where you can advance and apply for funds to do the planning and design. Those are typically, though, confined to, again, what California Department of Fish and Wildlife has identified as a priority, and they need your data to determine where those are. So again, that's another way to get plugged in.
Thank you for your question, Allison. And let's see, I think our next questions would be coming from Matt Weiser and Alexa Mergen. Do you guys mind unmuting and asking your questions?
Yeah, thank you. It's sort of a two-pronged question. First is about whether you're working to lower speed limits and maybe educate drivers about speeding, violating speed limits. And secondly, are you working to actually close roads to traffic either permanently or seasonally to help wildlife? Because certain times a year, especially when daylight savings time changes, we've noticed a lot more roadkill in the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta and other places.
Yeah, in terms of reducing speed limits, I don't think that's really something that folks talk about often as a solution, and primarily because a lot of the research shows you have to be going actually pretty slow to avoid collisions with animals. I think around 35 miles an hour is typically so, but on the flip side, I have seen efforts in other states to actually have revenue that's developed from speeding tickets in areas that are important for wildlife, that the proceeds from that go towards crossing. So that's a policy option I've seen, not here in California, but in other states that have been advanced to try to address that. But in terms of action, so that's been, again, as a way to develop revenue to advance wildlife crossings. But scientifically, from what I understand from the research, is you have to be actually reducing your speed considerably lower than our speed limits a lot of times to actually effectively reduce collisions with wildlife. And I'm sorry, can you remind me of the other question?
Yeah, the second question was about actually closing roads
Right.
either permanently or seasonally.
Yeah, and I have also not seen any efforts undertaken to try to close roads with Caltrans. I'm not sure what that would take, but I'd be curious to see some of those examples that you mentioned in the Delta and where that might be potentially feasible. I will note, though, we are doing work not on state highway system roads, but within the Forest Service, because if you're familiar, they have significant roads within their national forest system, which have impacts on wildlife. So we're doing work with them to identify where are those intersecting with important migration corridors and other habitats that are sensitive to wildlife, and is there opportunity to close those down? So again, a little bit outside of the transportation system on the state highway system, but that is one area where we are trying to get some roads closed in certain areas.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, for your question. And I think our next questions are coming from Lena. Lena, do you mind unmuting and asking?
Hi. Hi, Mari. Thank you so much for this presentation and the incredible videos. They're such a pleasure to watch. I don't know if this would be something that would be difficult to determine, but I was just curious. You showed us a lot of overcrossings and undercrossings, and if critters have a preference for one or the other. or if it's just dependent on the landscape and how it has to be built and they just have to make do with whatever. But I noticed they seem to be going into some pretty small spaces that might make me pretty paranoid to go into. So I guess they use what they have. And then I did have a second one just about the same, whether humans and dogs also taking advantage of some of these crossings would have any impact, and if it would be a negative one, if they would perhaps detect like a dog scent, or if it's just they don't want to use them if humans are there. So got it. Snuck in 2 questions there.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. That's a great question. Yes, in answer to your question, specific designs are necessary for specific species. Sometimes I'm almost a little hesitant to share some of the videos of the bears squeezing in those small culverts because I'm worried folks will be like, oh, well, 2.5-foot culverts are fine. Because those are kind of extenuating circumstances. But we do have certain certain species specifications, for example, pronghorn in the Highway 395 area. These are typically open plain species. They don't live in forests. And so the thought of anything over their head is very scary to them. So we did actually record one pronghorn going through one exceptionally large underpass, but that's not typically the case. So if you want to be connecting habitats for pronghorn, it's almost required that you build an overpass. And overpasses, the science bears out, is in most instances, in the most case, typically has the most conservation benefits for the vast majority of species. But if folks have seen some of the price tags associated with those overpasses, they're not always realistic in terms of being able to actually implement them. On our research on Highway 395, we have found by far the most effective crossing is actually a 12-foot corrugated culvert. We have 2 of those on 395, and they have facilitated over 50% of all wildlife passages in our 70-mile stretch of study. So, and some animals, like some of those newts and other critters, will only use kind of the really small tunnels. So it's again, there's a ton of different solutions to a really complicated problem, but yes, there are different design specifications for different species. And then, oh yeah, the human and dogs potentially being deterrents. Typically, yes. But this also is it depends kind of answer. I think on some of these broader and larger, more rural landscapes, like we're looking at on Lassen County on 395, we see our wildlife being a bit more sensitive to human presence. And so that is an area where we're seeing they actually are a bit more deterred when we see ranchers or dogs come on camera. But in other areas, like in the Tahoe Basin, they have very few opportunities to move. And if they have one crossing and one safe way to take it, and they know that's safe, even if there's a human or dog that's going through with relative frequently, those are instances where we still see functional structures. So it depends answer, but yes, sometimes they do. Every time they do, I think it's just a matter of degree.
Thank you for your questions, Lena. And Roger, I think is the next question. Roger, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Okay. Hi. I wanted to ask about the California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. I work there as a docent, and we have an exhibit where kids can crawl through a tunnel, and their brothers and sisters and parents can watch them on a screen because there's a camera trap there. And so it's pretty effective once they realize what it is. Of course, they want to crawl through a tunnel anyway. But I just wanted to ask, I mean, that's on the educational side, which is good. But as far as the research, do you have any collaboration with them?
With Cal Academy of Sciences?
Yeah.
I do not. I connected with somebody there a couple years ago, and I recall that this was coming online, but no, I haven't collaborated them. But it sounds like a great exhibit. I'd love to come check it out.
Yeah, you better check it out. Yeah.
I think you had another question too, Roger, a little later. Do you want to ask that now?
Oh, I think my wife Audrey wanted to know that.
The question was, how do these animals know to go to this one small narrow tunnel or bridge? And are there some that just don't know? How do they know where to go?
Okay.
That's a great question. I think that might be like the most common question I get with wildlife crossings is, yeah, how do they know where the structures are and how to use them? And that's something that a lot of this camera work and roadkill data is helping us understand, is that wildlife don't just move randomly throughout the landscape. They actually do prefer certain ridge lines and habitat features. And so when you see where those features intersect with the road, you're often seeing that's where wildlife are crossing in higher concentrations. So that's one way, is, you know, looking at the landscape features and how wildlife are moving throughout the landscape. So 395, for example, is an area where we actually had GPS collar data telling us how deer were migrating and where they were crossing. So that's one indication of that. Another is the roadkill data. And the roadkill data isn't necessarily telling us where wildlife are crossing the most frequently, but it's telling us where wildlife are crossing the most frequently unsuccessfully. So that might be because you might have a section of roadway and you might have a ton of wildlife crossing, but there's a curve up on the roadway and wildlife are crossing there too, but you're seeing the most roadkill there because there's a blind curve and that's where drivers are hitting them. But that's not necessarily where you want to put a crossing, because that's not where most of them are moving. So that's an area where we want to actually understand how wildlife are moving through the landscape and put the structures there. But to ensure that is effective is you pair that with fencing. And so you add fencing to the structure. So as wildlife approach the highway, they reach the fencing and typically will kind of walk along the fencing until they get to a structure where they can safely pass. So that was kind of a long, convoluted answer, but basically data helps us kind of predict how wildlife are going to move. Fencing helps kind of funnel them and direct them to where those actual crossings are.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for your questions, Roger. We had another question from Janet. Janet, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Yes, thanks. This is sort of a follow-up to Lena's questions, and fantastic presentation, by the way. Thank you so much. I'm particularly interested in pairings of wildlife and long-distance trail crossings. Speaking as a representative of a long-distance trail organization, we trails have some of the same needs that wildlife have in terms of connectivity. That's the primary goal. And anyway, so I was just interested in any thoughts or tips you might have on how to pair human or long distance trail crossings with wildlife crossings. How can, and this could be, you know, obviously a follow-up conversation, but how can we partner and collaborate better to plan both of them at the same time and to get maximum public benefit from the costs?
Yes, Janet, I would love to chat with you about this more. Thanks for your question. Yeah, because that is, you know, I'm an outdoor recreator. I grew up hiking on our public lands and in our local communities, and so I love trails. And unfortunately, sometimes they're not always compatible with wildlife. Sometimes they are. I live in Sacramento, and I can tell you the American River Trail is where you see deer and wildlife. That's where they live, and it's in very close corridors with recreation opportunities. But there are instances where you might have more sensitive species, or again, some of these larger landscapes where wildlife might be more sensitive, where you do have to be really considerate of where you're siting those trails in a way that aren't going to have some sort of negative impact. But a good case study that would be good to maybe connect with and learn more about, and I'd be happy to make this connection if you're interested, is actually on the east side of the Tahoe Basin. The Tahoe Rim Trail Association is working with some of our partners at Pathways for Wildlife and Nevada Department of Transportation, because on Spooner Summit on Highway 50, there's a, you know, it's Tahoe Rim Trail, goes around the Lake Tahoe Basin, and it's an extremely dangerous place to cross. It's a 4-lane highway and really fast vehicles going back and forth, and you see hikers like running across the road. Unsurprisingly, we're also seeing wildlife get hit there. And so that's an example of where we're trying to work together to build structures that accommodate both wildlife and people. And that is an area where that could work a little bit better, because again, that's kind of where the landscape is funneled. We anticipate that hikers and recreators are probably not going to be using that structure once it gets dark, and that's when we see the most wildlife activity. And so that's a example of where you could potentially pair both of those things together in one structure. But yeah, happy to chat with you about this more. We actually just hired somebody to complete a literature review on the impacts of recreation and wildlife to get a better understanding of how we can be siting recreation in a way that isn't going to have these unforeseen impacts on kind of these large landscape connections for wildlife.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Janet, for your question. And we actually have a follow-up question from Laura. Laura, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yes, so up here, we see so many Western gray squirrels killed trying to get across the road. Their territory, the road goes right through their territory, and so to get from one side to another. Um, Often for fire purposes, the connectivity between trees on both sides of the road, is broken. They disrupt the canopy. What about these rope crossings? That sounds like a possibility for small mammals, especially squirrels.
Yeah, that's a good question. And admittedly, I haven't looked into the research on kind of what structures squirrels will use. And so I'm almost curious, and again, I'm speaking totally off the cuff here, and not as a rotocologist, but I think back to those monkey crossings of the ropes across the canopy and wondered if something like that could be an easy fix. Again, just speaking off the cuff. But yeah, the thinning on either side of the road for fire to address fire concerns is actually an issue we're facing significantly in the Sierra, especially when we're trying to create connectivity for some of the species that really prefer that dense canopy cover, like pine marten. How can we work with the Forest Service to maybe not do thinning in just a few areas that allow them to and provide safe passage in those areas? I have not cracked the code and figured out a way to actually get that off the ground, but it is a conversation we've been having, and happy to keep you in the loop on how this conversation has turned out, because it is, yeah, and a lot of often incompatible with some of those wildlife needs.
Yeah, and when I used to live in Oakland, we would watch. Of course, these were eastern fox squirrels, but they'd go along the wires, and
Mhm.
they would get from one place to another. I don't know if western gray squirrels would use rope or a wire or something like that, but it's just a thought because it's amazing how many are killed. Anyway, thank you so much. This is just a fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, and I think we just have one left with Matt. One last question from Matt about Caltrans installation. Matt, do you mind unmuting and asking?
Yeah, thank you. The question is about K-rail, the concrete median barrier. I see a lot of animals killed when they run up against that. Are you working with Caltrans or anybody else to modify that or stop at the installation of it?
Yeah, so there's good news and bad news with those medians. Starting with the bad news, which is what you've noted, it creates a barrier for wildlife movement. And but the upside of that is where Caltrans is installing those now with or at least with some of the projects I've been working on them, because I think is some new spec that they have to incorporate in some areas, is that now they recognize that installing those medians are impact wildlife connectivity, and so they have to mitigate those impacts. So on 395, for example, where I mentioned wildlife or Caltrans is installing 5 wildlife underpasses, that's because they're actually going to be installing a barrier on that section of Highway 395, and to mitigate that impact, they're installing those 5 wildlife underpasses, which in my opinion, and looking at the data, is going to be a way better solution for wildlife than what they were trying to do in crossing at grade with no median. So that is some silver lining, I think, with some of those median structures we're seeing put up. Another example is on Highway 50 outside of Placerville. They erected those median barriers and installed a number of wildlife undercrossings as mitigation for that project with fencing as well. So there's kind of some good and bad news with that, but I have seen several examples of where Caltrans is mitigating those impacts.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we're at the top of the hour, so I think we can wrap up there. But I just want to thank Mari so much for being here and for giving this talk today. And thank you to you all for joining. I think it's been a great hour of learning and some great questions from everyone. So thank you so much. And if we don't mind just like all unmuting and I can count down from 3, we can all say thank you to Mari. If we all just, okay, I'll count us down from 3. Okay. After 1. So 3, 2, 1.
Thank
you,
you.
Mari.
Great, great
Thank you
presentation.
so much. And those of you listening, if you're interested in more events like this, I encourage you to become a Bay Nature member. We have free and discounted tickets to our events. And thank you so much all for coming today. I'll send out a link to today's recording as well as some links that Mari provided earlier that provide more information. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope to see you at a future event.
Thanks all.
Thank
If you have
you.
questions.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.